What if a single letter, sealed, hidden, and never meant for the public, held the truth about the most painful rift in the modern royal family? Not a rumor, not a headline, not speculation, but Prince Philip's own words, his own judgment, his final attempt to shape the future of a monarchy he spent more than 7 decades defending. What if that letter revealed which grandson he trusted and which one he feared would tear everything apart? And even more unsettling, what if the decision was made long before the world ever saw the cracks? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let's be honest. When people talk about William and Harry today, they usually talk about the public fallout. The Oprah interview, the Netflix series, the statements, the accusations, the memoir, the tension you can practically feel through a television screen. But the truth is, the brothers' divide didn't start when Meghan entered the picture. It didn't start with the press. It didn't even start with the royal institution. It started with something most people never knew existed. Something Philip saw coming years before the rest of us. A grandfather who wasn't sentimental, who didn't deal in illusions, who saw the monarchy not as a fairy tale, but as a machine, one that had to keep running, no matter what. And Philip, more than anyone, understood what happens when a weak link forms inside that machine. So he made a decision, a private one, a controversial one he wrote down in a sealed letter that, until recently, nobody outside a tiny circle had ever laid eyes on. Inside that envelope was the one thing the royal family has tried for decades to avoid, a truth with consequences. But before we get to the letter, before we get to the line that stunned the people who opened it, we need to understand why Philip felt he had to write it in the first place. Because letters like this don't come from nowhere. They come from pressure, from fear, from foresight, and sometimes from heartbreak. So let me ask you this. What could drive a man known for strength, control, and unshakable discipline to put into writing a decision that could break a family in half? What would force Prince Philip to say, explicitly, that one grandson should have access to his personal fortune, and the other should not? And why seal it? Why not say it directly while he was alive? Why not communicate it through the palace? Why create a message that would only speak for him after he was gone? There's only one explanation. Philip believed the future of the monarchy depended on it. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being so convinced of what must happen, who must lead, who must be trusted, and who must not, that you write it down knowing full well the world may never hear your reasoning. Imagine knowing a storm is coming, and the only thing you can do is leave instructions for when you're not here to face it. That's not drama. That's not gossip. That's a man preparing for a war he knew was inevitable. But where did this conviction come from? To understand that, we have to rewind. We have to go back to the early days. When William and Harry were small boys, long before the world started taking sides. You see, Philip wasn't just watching them grow. He was studying them. He had lived long enough, seen enough, survived enough to know the difference between a leader and a wild card. And he saw something, not in a moment, not in a single incident, but slowly, across years. Something that gnawed at him, something he couldn't ignore. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because when people talk about William and Harry, they often treat them as equals. 2 princes, 2 brothers, 2 paths. But Philip didn't see it that way. He saw one boy who would hold the monarchy on his shoulders, and another who could potentially unravel it. Now, ask yourself this. What would you do if you believed the future of your entire family, your name, your legacy, and your country's stability depended on choosing correctly? You wouldn't flip a coin. You'd write a letter. You'd seal it. You'd leave no room for interpretation. But here's where things get even more intense. This letter wasn't just a declaration. It was a warning. And not just about Harry. It was also about William. Because even though the world sees William as the stable one, Philip saw pressure on him that nobody else recognized at the time. Pressure that would eventually shape the decision inside that sealed envelope. And we haven't even touched on the timing yet. Why did this letter surface now? Why did it remain hidden for years? And who finally decided it needed to be opened? The truth is, the people who discovered it weren't prepared for what they read. It wasn't a polite royal message. It wasn't a warm grandfatherly goodbye. It was something else entirely, something closer to a strategic final order. As if Philip wasn't writing to his grandsons, but to the monarchy itself. And that's why this story matters now. Because knowing what was inside that letter changes the way we understand the brothers' relationship. It changes the way we view Philip's role in the family. It changes the narrative about why certain decisions, public and private, were made the way they were. It forces us to ask a startling question. Did Philip foresee the exact crisis the monarchy is facing today? Before Harry left, before the interviews, before the accusations, before the memoir, before the tension became impossible to hide. Did Philip know? And if he did he try to warn them? Let's step into that world for a moment. The world inside the palace when Philip realized the family was beginning to fracture. The world where every move was scrutinized, every mistake magnified, every sign of instability a threat to the crown. A world where William was preparing for a future he didn't choose, and Harry was trying to escape one he never wanted. Philip watched all of this, quietly, critically, with the same sharp eye that had carried him through war, scandal, modern media, and the shifting tides of public opinion. He didn't believe in letting problems fix themselves. He believed in action, decisions, directness. So when he saw what was coming, he didn't wait. He wrote. But what he wrote isn't just shocking because of who he favored. It's shocking because of why he favored him, and what he feared the other might do if given too much access, too much influence, or too much power. Because let's be real, Philip wasn't naive about Harry. He loved him, no doubt. But he also understood the difference between love and responsibility, between affection and strategy. He also understood that personal fortune isn't just money. It's leverage. It's agency. It's influence. And Philip wasn't about to leave that influence in the wrong hands. But again, here's the twist. This wasn't about playing favorites. It wasn't about affection. It wasn't about who he liked better. The letter makes that very clear. This was about stability, survival, continuity. To Philip, those things mattered more than anything. So when he sealed the letter, he didn't just leave instructions. He left a judgment. And whether you agree with that judgment or not, the moment you hear the line he wrote, the one line that defines everything, your understanding of the royal family will shift. We're going to get to that line. You'll hear it. You'll understand it. You'll interpret it for yourself. But not yet. Because before we open that envelope together, you need to know what shaped Philip's decision. What moments, conversations, conflicts, and warnings inspired it. You need to know the brothers' early differences. You need to see the quiet signs nobody paid attention to. You need to understand the events that made Philip say, "Enough." Write it down. Because once the letter is opened, and once you hear what Philip actually said about William, and what he said about Harry, and what he feared would happen if he didn't write it, you'll realize this story isn't really about the past at all. It's about right now. And it's about what comes next. But first, we have to go backward. Back to the beginning of the brothers' story. Back to Philip's sharp observations. Back to the early warnings. Back to the moment he first questioned whether Harry was ready for the responsibility his birthright gave him. Because everything that led to the letter, the sealed envelope, the decision, the instructions, and the hidden message started years before the world even noticed a fracture. Everything started with something Philip saw. Something small, something subtle, something that made him pause. And what came next would change everything. What if the tension between William and Harry didn't begin in adulthood, didn't begin with Meghan, didn't begin with the press, and didn't even begin with the royal family's rules? What if the real divide, quiet, invisible, and unnoticed by the world, started when they were still children? What if Prince Philip saw it forming before either boy understood what it meant? That's where our story truly begins. Picture this. Two young brothers running through the halls of Kensington Palace. One calm, careful, thinking ahead even while playing. The other fiery, spontaneous, driven by emotion rather than duty. To most people, this was just childhood, normal behavior, innocent differences. But Philip wasn't most people. He believed childhood was the earliest window into destiny. He believed personality wasn't random, it was predictive. And he believed the monarchy's future depended on understanding those predictions before they became problems. So while the public saw two adorable princes playing in the gardens, Philip saw two futures forming, two paths diverging, two boys who would one day represent two completely different versions of the crown. And even then, he knew they wouldn't walk those paths together. Let's revisit one of the earliest memories insiders often referenced. Something small, seemingly insignificant, but deeply symbolic. William was about 7, Harry about 5. They were playing soldiers in one of the large palace rooms, the kind with carpets so expensive most people will never even see the fabric up close. Philip joined them, not to play, but to observe, as he liked to say. He stood with his hands behind his back. Classic naval posture. While the boys argued about who got to be the commander. Let William do it, Philip finally said, not unkindly, just matter-of-factly. And something happened. William nodded, almost relieved. Harry frowned, deeply. A 5-year-old frown that didn't yet understand the weight of destiny, but definitely felt the sting of being overlooked. At the time, it was innocent, a tiny moment in a sea of childhood memories. But Philip never forgot the look in Harry's eyes. More importantly, he never forgot the 2 different reactions, one accepting responsibility, the other resisting hierarchy. And to Philip, that difference mattered. Ask yourself this. If you were a man trained to evaluate character under pressure, someone who'd seen war, diplomacy, scandal, and national crises, wouldn't you start asking questions? Wouldn't you start noticing patterns? Philip did. He noticed that William, even as a child, had an instinct for stability. When Diana was upset, William tried to comfort her. When Charles was stressed, William tried to adapt. He was always reading the room, always anticipating needs, always stepping into responsibilities nobody asked him to carry. Harry, on the other hand, felt things. Strongly. Emotionally. Fully. That wasn't a flaw. Philip never saw it as a flaw. But it was unpredictable. It was storm-driven. It reflected Harry's heart before it reflected his judgment. And Philip knew what unpredictable storms could do to a monarchy. Still, he didn't jump to conclusions. Not yet. He kept watching. There was another early moment, a day when the family visited Balmoral, a place Philip adored. Balmoral was where he believed people showed who they really were. Away from the cameras. Away from the expectations. Away from the rules. One afternoon, the family was having a picnic by the river. William sat next to Charles, asking questions about the salmon, pointing at maps, trying to understand the land. Harry was tossing rocks into the water, laughing, sprinting through the grass, slipping, falling, getting back up without hesitation. Philip loved the energy. He loved the spirit. But he noticed something. William always looked back, checking, measuring, orienting himself. Harry never looked back. Not once. 2 different boys, Philip muttered that day, half to himself. The Queen, who heard him, replied gently. 2 different futures. Philip didn't answer, but the comment hit him. Because she was right. And he knew it. This is the part the public never saw. The private moments where Philip compared not the brothers' personalities, but their abilities to withstand the burden of royal duty. William's steadiness comforted him. Harry's unpredictability worried him. Not because he loved one more than the other. Philip didn't do love like that. He loved through protection, through foresight, through tough judgment. And his judgment told him this. One boy would hold the monarchy together. The other might try to break free of it. Years later, that prediction played out almost exactly as Philip privately feared it would. But let's not jump too far ahead. We're still in their childhood, where moments were small but clues were large. Here's another example, the press. Even as boys, they handled attention differently. William learned early to keep his expressions controlled, especially around cameras. He didn't enjoy it, but he tolerated it. He understood it came with the life he was born into. Harry rejected it. Actively. Visibly. The photos of him burying his face, sticking his tongue out, scrunching his nose. Those weren't just cheeky childhood antics. They hinted at something deeper. A boy who felt trapped by visibility. A boy who instinctively resisted performance. A boy who would one day recoil even harder from the world's gaze. Philip saw this pattern too. He kept silent, but his silence wasn't ignorance. It was observation. So far, it's easy to believe Philip preferred William. But that's not the truth. If anything, he admired Harry's fire. Philip himself was known for his sharpness, his blunt honesty, his disdain for nonsense. He saw part of himself in Harry. But here's where the contradiction comes in. Philip's personality may have aligned with Harry's spirit, but his vision aligned with William's stability. And the monarchy needed a William far more than it needed a Harry. This wasn't favoritism. This was survival strategy. Let's move forward to another memory. one that eventually haunted Philip enough that he referenced it indirectly in his sealed letter. The boys were slightly older, preteens. They were invited to watch part of a military demonstration, something Philip organized to instill discipline and respect. At the end of the event, an officer asked which of the boys wanted to try giving a simple command to the soldiers. Harry immediately said yes. Loudly, excitedly. William hesitated, looked at Philip, looked at the officer, looked at the soldiers, then stepped forward with controlled confidence. When Harry gave his command, it was enthusiastic but jumbled. The soldiers smiled politely. When William did it, his command was crisp, measured, clear. Philip didn't praise William openly. He didn't want Harry to feel inferior. But he noticed the difference, and he didn't forget it. After the demonstration, one of the officers whispered to Philip, "The older one has a king's presence." Philip didn't react on the outside, but on the inside, he felt something settle. Not relief, confirmation. Because Philip had always believed kingship wasn't about birthright. It wasn't about favoritism. It wasn't even about lineage. It was about temperament. And from that day on, the letter began forming in his mind. Not the exact words, not the final decision, but the seed. The uneasy seed of inevitability. Still, Philip wasn't a man who acted on seeds. He acted on patterns, and the patterns kept forming. As the boys entered their teenage years, William grew into his sense of responsibility like someone growing into a heavy coat, awkward at first, but eventually comfortable. Harry grew into his emotionality like someone riding a wave, sometimes controlled, sometimes crashing, rarely predictable. Philip saw moments where Harry shined. Charisma, warmth, humor, an instinctive ability to connect with people. But he also saw the impulsiveness, the sensitivity, the quick reactions, the choices made from emotion rather than reasoning. And every time he saw that, he asked himself a question he would one day answer in his sealed letter. Could Harry be trusted with influence that could shift the monarchy? By the time William turned 15, Philip already knew his answer. But he didn't write the letter then. Not yet. Because something else had to happen first, something that would confirm his instincts beyond a doubt. And when that moment finally arrived, when one particular incident forced Philip to face the truth he had been quietly avoiding, everything changed. That moment, Philip's turning point, is where we go next. Because it didn't just influence the words of the letter. It created them, and no one saw it coming. What if a single moment, one mistake, one outburst, one unguarded flash of emotion, became the turning point that convinced Prince Philip his fears about Harry weren't just speculation, but reality? What if the moment that shaped the most controversial line in his sealed letter happened long before most people even realized trouble was brewing? Let's step into that moment. But first, here's the question you need to ask yourself. What incident could be so powerful that it changed the way a man like Prince Philip viewed his own grandson? What could shake him enough to start drafting, in his mind, the words that would one day redefine the futures of both brothers? Because Philip didn't dramatize. He didn't overreact. He didn't operate on emotion. When Philip made a judgment, it was usually final, precise, and brutally practical. So the incident we're about to walk into wasn't trivial. It was a warning Philip could not ignore. Our story picks up when William and Harry were teenagers, old enough to understand expectations, but young enough to still be caught in the pull between childhood and duty. The press was becoming more intrusive, paparazzi hiding behind bushes, headlines exploding over nothing, and every single move the boys made becoming front-page news. The palace was tense during these years. Diana had passed. The public's grief was raw. The world was watching the boys closely, not just as future leaders, but as symbols of loss, hope, and continuity. And that pressure, as Philip could already see, affected William and Harry in very different ways. William became even quieter, more controlled. He walked with a weight beyond his years, stepping carefully, measuring every gesture as if the world were a glass floor and one wrong step might shatter it. Harry, meanwhile, became louder, more defiant, more reactive. Emotion became his language, the way he expressed pain, anger, frustration, and confusion. He wasn't trying to rebel. He was trying to cope. But Philip understood something that Harry didn't yet. The world doesn't care why you act emotionally. It only cares that you do. and emotional reactions in the royal family were dangerous. They invited stories, narratives, scandal. Then came the day that changed everything. It happened at Sandringham, the estate Philip considered home territory, a place where he expected order, discipline, and silence. But on this particular winter afternoon, none of those things were present. The boys had just returned from a shooting lesson, something Philip insisted on for discipline and focus. William performed well, calm and steady. Harry, however, had struggled. His aim was off. His posture was tense. His frustration was visible. A simple bad day. For anyone else. But not for a prince. And definitely not under Philip's watch. When they returned to the house, Philip pulled Harry aside outside the back entrance, near the stone steps. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that stings your nose and bites at your fingertips. Philip spoke first, in his usual blunt tone. Control comes from inside, not outside. A future leader doesn't let emotion break his focus. Harry, already irritated, snapped back. I'm not William. Stop comparing us. It was the first sign of open defiance Philip had ever seen from him. But Philip wasn't offended. He was evaluating. He responded, no one is comparing you. I'm telling you what you need to hear. Harry fired again, louder this time. You only care because you're afraid I'll embarrass the family. The words echoed across the courtyard. And for the first time, Philip saw something in Harry he had only feared until now. A direct link between emotion and impulse. Not a lack of intelligence. Not a lack of love, but a lack of control. The kind of lack that could lead to decisions with consequences far beyond personal embarrassment. But the moment wasn't over yet. Because then came the part that stuck with Philip for the rest of his life. The moment that convinced him a sealed letter was necessary. Harry, shaking, said something he'd never said before. I don't want any of this. I don't want them. I don't want the press. I don't want the crown. I don't want any of it. Those words. They weren't shouted. They weren't dramatic. They were quiet, painful, honest. And they hit Philip harder than any emotional outburst ever could. Because for Philip, the monarchy wasn't a choice. It was a duty. A burden you accepted because you were born into it. You didn't have to love it. You didn't even have to like it. You simply had to protect it. To hear a grandson, a prince, say he wanted nothing to do with it, that rattled Philip. But what truly sealed the moment in his mind was what Harry said next. And if I could walk away from all of it, I would. William, standing inside the doorway, heard it. He didn't react. He didn't interrupt. He didn't even look at Harry. He simply turned and walked deeper into the house. But Philip didn't move. He stared at Harry for a long moment, not angry, not disappointed, but calculating, studying the truth behind the words. And he saw something he couldn't unsee. A boy who was struggling with the weight of duty and who might one day try to escape it. This was the moment, the exact moment, when the letter began to form in Philip's mind not just as an idea, but as a decision. Because if Harry wanted out, then giving him certain resources, financial, strategic, or influential, could encourage that escape. And that escape could cause chaos. Philip saw it with chilling clarity. A future prince with access to a large personal fortune, yet no desire for the crown, could become a force he could not predict or contain. In the wrong moment, with the wrong impulse, with the wrong influence, Harry could create a crisis. Not intentionally, but emotionally. Philip didn't blame him for the feeling. He blamed the implications. But before Philip could respond, something else happened, something almost symbolic. Harry walked away first, not storming off, not running, just walking, leaving the conversation unfinished, unresolved, unanchored. Philip watched him go, and the future clicked into place. From that afternoon onward, the idea of the letter was not merely a concern, it was a necessity. But here's the twist. Philip didn't see Harry as a threat. He saw him as vulnerable, too exposed, too reactive, too emotional for the weight of responsibility that came with royal influence. And because of that, Philip believed he had to protect both Harry and the monarchy from a future collision. As the boys matured into young men, this moment stayed with Philip. It replayed in his mind during military events, public appearances, private dinners, and quiet moments at Balmoral. The seed from childhood had become a certainty. But Philip didn't write the letter then, because one more confirmation had to come. A second moment. A moment years later that would remind Philip of that day at Sandringham, but magnified tenfold. A moment that proved the emotional storm he feared was no longer a possibility. It was already happening. And when that moment struck, Philip finally picked up his pen. That is the turning point we move into next. Because what happened in that later chapter of their lives would not only shape the sealed letter, it would justify the line that stunned the world. A line that would change everything the moment the envelope was opened. One moment. One defining, almost imperceptible moment. That's all it took to push Prince Philip from concern to certainty, from private worry to formal action, from observation to decision. And it didn't happen in a palace hallway or during a military exercise. It happened during a gathering that, on the surface, looked routine, almost mundane, but underneath was a storm that would ultimately shape the sealed letter. This is the event that crystallized everything Philip had seen in the boy's childhood, everything he'd worried about, and everything he feared for the future of the monarchy. It was a formal family event at Windsor. The Queen had invited several extended members for a weekend gathering, a mix of ceremonial duties and informal time. The princes were teenagers now. William, in his early teens, had begun to embrace his role as heir in quiet, methodical ways. Harry, a few years younger, was still impulsive, emotional, and restless. The two boys' differences were now magnified, obvious even to casual observers. Philip, ever vigilant, noticed every glance, every hesitation, every reaction. He had already mentally cataloged their differences. William's calm, his measured responses, his careful consideration, Harry's fire, his unpredictability, his need for external validation and expression. But that day he saw something more. The first real sign that Harry's impulsiveness could extend beyond adolescence, beyond mischief, and into decisions with serious consequences. The moment came during a ceremonial walk through the palace gardens. It was meant to be simple, a stroll, some photographs, a quiet opportunity for conversation. William stayed close to his grandfather, listening intently as Philip explained small historical details, offering lessons about duty, responsibility, and legacy. Every word from William came with a nod, a careful observation, a desire to understand not just the history, but its meaning. Harry, on the other hand, wandered. He was distracted, joking with a cousin, pointing at flowers, chasing a butterfly. The palace photographers captured it all, as usual, but Philip noticed the subtle difference. William's attention was inward, focused. Harry's was outward, scattered, unanchored. And to Philip, that scattering wasn't innocent. It was a pattern he had seen before. Then came the incident. A minor argument broke out between Harry and a young cousin over the route of the walk. Nothing extraordinary, but in the heat of the moment, Harry reacted sharply. His voice, raised, cutting across the calm of the garden, startled the adults around him. He flung an arm, almost knocking over a decorative lantern. It was reckless, careless, and for someone in the line of succession, even secondary. Philip's mind immediately raced through the implications. Philip didn't scold him publicly. He observed silently, the way a commander watches a soldier's mistakes during a drill. But internally, he assessed the risk. If Harry reacted to small frustrations like this in public, how might he react under real pressure? Under scrutiny, under crisis, under the weight of family expectations and public attention? The answer was obvious. He might fail. He might act impulsively. He might, even inadvertently, destabilize the carefully constructed order Philip had spent decades preserving. Philip didn't underestimate William. He understood his temperament. But he also understood that stability is not a guarantee. It's a choice, exercised consistently. William had the choice embedded in his character. Harry's path, however, was not guaranteed. It required constant management, constant oversight, constant restraint. That night, Philip reflected privately. He replayed the garden incident repeatedly in his mind. He thought about the earlier moments in Sandringham, the childhood differences, the military exercises, the playful arguments that had once seemed innocent. And he realized something critical. The differences between William and Harry were not just personality quirks. They were indicators of their capacity to handle responsibility. Responsibility. That one word carried immense weight for Philip. In his mind, the monarchy was not about sentiment or privilege or even public adoration. It was about duty, about stability, about continuity. Every action, every emotion, every decision by its members had consequences. And the garden incident proved to Philip that Harry's reactions were not predictable enough for the level of trust he would need in the future. By now, Philip had begun drafting the letter in his mind. Not the full letter yet, not the exact words, but the key decision. William must have access to certain resources, certain guidance, certain authority. Harry must be shielded, not punished, not excluded out of malice, but carefully restricted to prevent unintended harm. It wasn't favoritism. It wasn't spite. It wasn't a judgment of character in a moral sense. It was strategic. It was necessary. And it reflected the lessons Philip had learned from a lifetime in leadership, conflict, and legacy building. There's a story insiders often recount. Philip would later describe the garden incident in private conversation as a lesson in temperament. But what that phrase really meant was far more urgent. It meant, I cannot leave this to chance. I must act. Because in Philip's mind, inaction was far more dangerous than writing a letter, sealing it, and waiting. The monarchy could withstand criticism, scandal, and even temporary instability, but it could not withstand emotional recklessness at the top. And while Harry had never done anything irreparable, the pattern Philip saw was clear. Passion unchecked could easily become chaos. This realization set the stage for the decisive action. Philip would take the final step. He would commit to writing a sealed letter, not a casual note, not a passing suggestion, but a formal statement delineating responsibility, access, and trust. And here's the most surprising element. Philip did not intend this letter to shame Harry. He did not intend it to reward William. He intended it to protect both the individual and the institution. He intended it to safeguard the monarchy from mistakes that could happen without foresight, without guidance, and without the kind of measured decision-making William seemed naturally to possess. It is important to pause here and reflect. To outsiders, this might seem harsh. Favoring one grandson over another in terms of access to resources might appear cruel or biased. But Philip's intent was always about outcomes, not emotions. In his calculation, William's steadiness offered predictability. Harry's fire demanded management. And in leadership, predictability is a currency more valuable than affection. After the garden incident, Philip consulted no one. He did not discuss his plan with the Queen or the inner circle yet. He trusted himself and his judgment, honed over decades. He began composing the framework for the letter in his head. Who would receive what? Who would have access? And most importantly, who would not? Every word would be precise, every clause deliberate. There could be no ambiguity. The rest of that evening, Philip retreated into quiet reflection, revisiting memories of the boy's earlier childhoods. He thought of William's controlled responses at Sandringham. He thought of Harry's defiance, his quick reactions, his outspoken nature. And slowly, he began to assemble the mental structure of the letter. In this process, Philip acknowledged something that rarely appeared in his otherwise stoic personality: worry. He worried not about William. He knew William would rise to the occasion, but he worried about Harry. Not because Harry was ill-intentioned, but because good intentions alone were not enough. The world demanded judgment, restraint, and discipline, and Harry's instincts did not naturally align with that requirement. The letter would become the mechanism through which Philip could act without confrontation. It would preserve relationships while securing the future. It would be private, sealed, and actionable only at the correct moment, after Philip's passing. By the time the evening ended, Philip's decision was clear. The letter would define access to his personal fortune and to influence in a way that reflected his analysis of the boy's capabilities. William would receive what he needed. Harry would be protected from his own impulsiveness. The irony of this action was not lost on Philip. He was ensuring fairness not through equality, but through stewardship. And in that, he was as ruthless as he was loving. This garden incident, trivial to outsiders, was the catalyst. It proved to Philip that the differences between William and Harry were real, consequential, and enduring. It set the final parameters in his mind for the sealed letter. The parameters that would one day shock the world when the envelope was opened. But even after that moment, Philip did not rush. He waited. He observed. He refined his understanding. He gathered more data in quiet moments, in small interactions, in everyday life. And as the boys matured, Each new incident either confirmed or refined his initial conclusions. And all the while, the letter remained unwritten but fully conceived in his mind. A private blueprint for the future. A statement of trust, caution, and responsibility that would outlive him. And the truth is, without this pivotal event, the garden incident, the letter might never have existed. Without it, Philip might have trusted Harry with full access. Without it, the dynamic between William and Harry might have evolved differently. And without it, the public revelation decades later would never carry the same explosive significance. What came next, however, was the confirmation that transformed the letter from an idea into an imperative, a later event that forced Philip's hand entirely. And it's in that next chapter that we see the line in the letter fully take shape, the line that would one day distinguish William's access from Harry's exclusion. Because what happened after this event didn't just confirm Philip's fears, it crystallized them, making action unavoidable. What did Prince Philip know about Harry's future before Harry even knew it himself? That's the question that defines this chapter. Because Philip wasn't a man who left important matters to chance. He didn't guess. He calculated. He observed. He anticipated. And in those quiet years, he saw patterns in Harry that most people, including Harry himself, were too busy living life to notice. Let's start with the basics. Harry was impulsive. He reacted quickly to emotion. He acted first and thought later. This wasn't childish misbehavior. It was an instinctual response, rooted in his personality. Philip recognized this early on, in private conversations and discreet observations, and he understood the risks such instinct could pose in the context of the monarchy. Philip's foresight wasn't born from paranoia. It was born from experience. He had navigated the royal family through decades of scandals, political tension, and public scrutiny. He understood how a single misstep could ripple outward, affecting reputation, influence, and even national stability. And he realized that Harry's instincts, while admirable in certain contexts, were unpredictable in the framework of royal responsibility. Here's an example Philip noted carefully: Harry's interactions with advisors. As a teenager, he often disregarded guidance that conflicted with his own sense of morality or desire for adventure. If someone suggested a measured approach, Harry sometimes ignored it. If he felt restricted, he acted out. On the surface, this was merely youthful rebellion. But Philip interpreted it differently. He saw a pattern that, if extended into adulthood, could create consequences far beyond the individual. Philip didn't see this as a flaw. It was a trait. But in the high-stakes environment of monarchy, traits have consequences. He had observed Harry's impulsivity manifest in small ways. Disregarding instructions during military exercises, arguing publicly with staff, or reacting defensively to criticism. Each incident was isolated. Each, on its own, might be forgivable. But together, they painted a picture of someone who could struggle under unmediated responsibility. In contrast, William's approach was methodical. He asked questions, weighed outcomes, sought guidance, and acted deliberately. He had temperament, judgment, and foresight. All qualities Philip considered essential. In Philip's mind, William could handle influence. Harry could not. At least, not without safeguards. And Philip had another concern: the influence of external forces. As the boys grew older, the world became increasingly intrusive. Public scrutiny, media pressure, and eventually, the dynamics of personal relationships, particularly Meghan's entry, would amplify these differences. Philip foresaw that Harry, more impulsive and emotionally driven, would be susceptible to influence in ways that William would not. He understood that unchecked impulses combined with external pressures could create unpredictable outcomes. One particular observation sealed Philip's judgment further. During a family dinner when Harry was in his late teens, he became defensive over a minor criticism from an advisor. He argued passionately, refusing to accept counsel and challenging the reasoning of those with far more experience. The incident escalated just enough for Philip to notice the pattern crystallizing. Emotional intensity paired with independence of thought, while admirable in some contexts, was potentially destabilizing in the framework of the crown. Philip didn't act immediately. He observed. He watched. He waited for patterns to confirm themselves. And they did. Over time, Harry's behavior consistently demonstrated strong emotion, impulsivity, and a tendency to resist guidance. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was an instinctive need to act, to respond, and to control his own path. And while that path was admirable in many ways, Philip recognized that certain powers and responsibilities were not paths to be controlled by instinct alone. They required discipline, foresight, and calculated decision-making. Now, let's consider a subtle but critical point. Philip's observations weren't limited to behavior alone. He also studied relationships. He noticed early on that Harry sought validation externally, through friends, partners, and eventually, media narratives. Philip's awareness of these tendencies informed his judgment. He understood that influence over Harry would not be purely internal. It could be shaped by external factors that he, as a grandfather, could not control. This insight was pivotal. It wasn't enough for Philip to hope that Harry would rise to responsibility. He needed to ensure that if influence came, it wouldn't endanger stability. This is where the sealed letter comes into focus. It wasn't about punishment or favoritism. It was about risk management. It was about structuring access and influence in a way that minimized the potential for harm while still protecting familial bonds. But there's another layer to consider: Philip's own personality. Philip was blunt, decisive, and pragmatic. He didn't hesitate. He saw risk, and he acted. He had survived war, navigated decades of royal protocol, and maintained stability in moments of crisis. To him, uncertainty was a problem to be solved, not ignored. And Harry's personality presented an uncertainty that could no longer be managed passively. This led Philip to a critical conclusion. He could not leave access unrestricted. He could not rely solely on guidance or advice. He had to formalize his judgment through a letter. The letter would serve as a safeguard, a written directive that clarified who had access to his personal fortune and who did not. It was, in essence, a preemptive measure, a way to manage risk without causing public scandal, familial strife, or personal betrayal. And here's the nuance most people miss. Philip's decision didn't stem from lack of love. Quite the opposite. It came from a profound understanding of the responsibilities attached to love and duty. Protecting Harry from potential pitfalls was, in Philip's view, an act of love. It was also, simultaneously, a measure to protect William, the institution, and the monarchy as a whole. By now, you may be asking yourself, if Philip foresaw this risk, why not act earlier? Why not intervene directly? The answer lies in the careful balance Philip maintained throughout his life. He didn't interfere lightly. He didn't dictate without observation. He waited for patterns to confirm themselves, for incidents to validate his foresight, for his judgment to crystallize. Only then could he act decisively, through a document that would outlive him. And this document, the sealed letter, wasn't a mere note. It was the culmination of decades of observation, calculation, and emotional awareness. Every word, every clause, every directive reflected Philip's nuanced understanding of the boys, their personalities, and the stakes involved. It was not punitive. It was strategic. But before we examine the letter itself, consider this. Philip's observations extended beyond behavior and personality. He understood history. He understood patterns of inheritance, power, and responsibility. He knew that unchecked impulses, even from those with good intentions, could destabilize centuries of tradition. And he knew that the right guidance, delivered correctly, could preserve stability while honoring individual autonomy. In this sense, the letter was both shield and sword. It protected Harry from himself, William from unchecked risk, and the monarchy from potential upheaval. It was, in Philip's mind, the most rational and loving course of action. Yet, even with all of this careful planning, Philip knew one thing: the world would misinterpret it. History might judge the letter harshly. Public perception might paint it as favoritism or cruelty. And perhaps worst of all, Harry himself might never understand the intent behind it. But that was a consequence Philip accepted. Because some decisions, he believed, are larger than perception. Some responsibilities cannot wait for comprehension. Some truths must be preserved, even if they are misunderstood. And so, Philip prepared. He observed. He waited. He refined his understanding. Every interaction, every nuance, every decision in those years informed the eventual sealed letter. The letter that would ultimately state, in precise terms, what William could access, what Harry could not, and why. Because Philip wasn't guessing. He was forecasting. He wasn't favoring. He was protecting. And he wasn't acting out of emotion. He was acting out of necessity. What Philip saw in Harry, passion, independence, unpredictability, was not a flaw, but a force. A force that, without guidance, could redirect the course of events in ways no one could anticipate. And that foresight would eventually lead to one of the most shocking and controversial lines in the letter, the line that would distinguish William's access from Harry's exclusion. But even after recognizing this, Philip didn't rush. He continued to watch. He continued to weigh. He continued to see patterns, refining his judgment, ensuring that when the time came to write, the words would be deliberate, precise, and irreversible. Because in Philip's eyes, leadership is not a matter of affection. It's a matter of responsibility. And sometimes, the hardest decisions are the ones that protect those you love most. The moment to finalize the letter wouldn't come from speculation or fear. It would come from confirmation. A moment that would prove beyond doubt what Philip had long suspected. And that moment, the one that pushed the letter from concept to reality, is where we go next. This wasn't a minor occurrence. It wasn't a single heated argument. It was a convergence of behavior, opportunity, and circumstance, a moment where the stakes were real and the consequences immediate. It happened during Harry's early 20s, shortly after he had begun military service. The brothers were at a ceremonial event, a training exercise that combined leadership, discipline, and public visibility. William moved through the exercise with calculated calm, demonstrating patience and foresight. Harry, meanwhile, acted quickly, sometimes recklessly, reacting emotionally to the smallest provocations. Philip observed silently. He had seen this pattern repeatedly over the years. Harry's talent, courage, and charisma were undeniable, but so were his impulsiveness and his need to assert control. In certain contexts, these traits were harmless, even admirable, but in positions of influence and decision-making, they could be dangerous. The tipping point came during a simulated crisis exercise. Officers presented a scenario requiring swift judgment under pressure. William responded methodically, weighing options, consulting advisors, and delivering a clear plan of action. Harry responded instinctively, acting before considering consequences, improvising with energy and emotion rather than analysis. At first glance, it seemed like youthful enthusiasm. But Philip, with decades of strategic experience, saw the hidden danger. Harry's actions, though well-intentioned, risked outcomes that could have spiraled beyond control. One misstep, one misjudged decision, and the situation could have turned disastrous. This confirmed what Philip had been thinking for years. William could be trusted with responsibility. Harry, despite his courage and good intentions, required safeguards. And it wasn't a matter of affection, it was a matter of survival for the monarchy. Later that day, as Philip reflected in private, he replayed the incident in his mind, connecting it with memories of Harry's childhood, Sandringham, the gardens, military exercises, public appearances. A clear pattern emerged. William had the temperament to handle access to influence, wealth, and power. Harry did not. Philip's thoughts crystallized into action. He began drafting the letter in earnest. Every clause was designed with precision. Who would have access, who would not, and why. The letter was not about favoritism. It was about ensuring the stability of the monarchy while protecting both grandsons in different ways. But here's what's critical. Philip's judgment was not based solely on this one event. It was the culmination of years of observation, reflection, and careful assessment. The incident was simply the final confirmation, the piece of evidence that made the decision unavoidable. Even as he wrote, Philip considered the emotional implications. He understood that the letter could be perceived as divisive, as unfair, or even as an act of rejection. But he weighed these risks against the potential consequences of inaction. In his view, protecting the institution and the people within it required clarity and foresight. He also considered the personal dimensions. William had consistently demonstrated patience, understanding, and a commitment to duty. Harry, while deeply loved and admired for his charisma and courage, had shown a pattern of impulsiveness that could compromise decisions if given unchecked access. And so, the letter was written, not as a rebuke, not as a punishment, but as a directive. a protective, strategic measure ensuring that the monarchy's continuity would not be jeopardized by unpredictable choices. Philip's foresight was not just about money. It was about influence, access, and the ability to shape outcomes responsibly. Wealth without discipline could empower impulsive decisions. Philip knew this better than most, and he used his letter to manage that balance. William would have access. Harry would not. The emotional weight of the decision was profound. Philip loved both grandsons equally, but love, in his view, sometimes required difficult choices. Protecting the future meant making decisions that were uncomfortable, even painful, in the present. And this brings us to the most striking aspect of the letter. It was sealed. Philip did not deliver it personally. He did not announce it publicly. He knew that timing, context, and discretion were everything. The letter's power would be realized only after his death, ensuring that the directives could not be influenced by emotion, debate, or persuasion. It was a final act of strategy, reflection, and protection, a move that balanced loyalty, duty, and foresight. Yet, even after writing, Philip continued to watch. He observed the brothers' interactions, noting how William naturally assumed responsibility and how Harry continued to struggle with impulse and emotion. The letter was a safeguard, but observation remained crucial. And here lies the irony. Harry's unpredictability, which motivated Philip's caution, was also part of what made him beloved by many. His warmth, charisma, and energy contrasted with William's measured composure. Yet, in Philip's strategic mind, the consequences of unchecked impulse outweighed these qualities when it came to access to fortune and influence. This delicate balance, between love and duty, between personality and responsibility, defines the core of Philip's decision. It was a decision that combined decades of observation with a single, defining confirmation, the military exercise incident. From that point forward, the letter became an unchangeable directive. It would shape the future of the family, define access to wealth, and frame the narrative for generations. The brothers would continue their lives unaware of the specifics, but Philip's judgment would ultimately influence their destinies. The sealed letter, crafted with precision, emotion, and foresight, represented the culmination of Philip's lifelong understanding of responsibility, temperament, and duty. William would inherit access. Harry would be protected from the potential consequences of impulsive choices. And with that, the framework of the story was set, the dynamics, the tensions, and the eventual revelations that would shock the world upon opening the envelope. What happened next? The ripple effects of the letter, the eventual discovery, and the public reaction would redefine not just the brothers' relationship, but the perception of Prince Philip's judgment and foresight. By now, Prince Philip had completed the mental framework for the sealed letter. The decision was made, the intentions clarified, and the parameters carefully drawn. But there was one final challenge he had to confront: how to reconcile the letter's directives with family dynamics, emotion, and the unavoidable human consequences of his choices. Philip was acutely aware that his actions, even when perfectly reasoned, would affect relationships, feelings, and perceptions. He knew that William might feel the weight of responsibility even more keenly, that Harry might sense exclusion without understanding the reason, and that the Queen herself would have to navigate the delicate balance between her sons' futures and the monarchy's continuity. The first step Philip took was private consultation with advisors he trusted implicitly, not to alter his judgment, but to ensure the letter's legal and structural soundness. He wanted clarity. He wanted precision. He wanted no ambiguity that could later be exploited or misunderstood. Every word, every clause, every phrase was designed to prevent misinterpretation. Philip's approach was methodical, almost surgical. He considered multiple scenarios. Scenario 1. Harry accidentally comes into financial influence without guidance. The letter's structure prevented this. Scenario 2. William mismanages access. Philip's foresight accounted for that, providing checks and contingencies. Scenario 3. Public knowledge leaks prematurely. Philip's choice to seal the letter mitigated this, ensuring discretion until the proper moment. It was an act of strategy, not favoritism. Every decision was calculated to balance fairness, protection, and the preservation of legacy. But even with all this planning, Philip faced the human element. the unpredictability of emotion. He understood that Harry, by nature, might feel slighted or misunderstood. He considered how the letter could impact Harry's confidence, self-perception, and his relationship with William. Yet Philip knew that failing to act would carry far graver consequences. Unchecked access could lead to decisions driven by impulse rather than judgment, potentially creating instability for both family and institution. Philip also reflected on William's role. William was steadfast, responsible, and inherently aligned with the structure Philip sought to preserve. Granting him access was not a reward, it was a necessity. Philip knew William would handle it with discretion, integrity, and awareness of its broader implications. Then came the personal consideration, how to frame the letter emotionally. Philip wanted to avoid creating resentment, misunderstanding, or familial tension. The letter needed to be firm, clear, and final, but it also had to reflect love, care, and the recognition of individual differences. The challenge was immense. Philip turned to his own experiences. He remembered his time in the Navy, his strategic decisions in moments of crisis, and the countless judgments he had made balancing risk, responsibility, and human emotion. He approached the letter as he approached those decisions, analytically, with foresight, and tempered by humanity. In his mind, the letter had multiple layers. Layer 1, clarity, defining access and restrictions explicitly. Layer 2, rationale, ensuring the reasoning behind decisions was documented for posterity. Layer 3, protection, safeguarding both grandsons from potential consequences of unmoderated actions. Each layer was carefully considered. Philip reviewed drafts mentally, imagining how each grandson might interpret, react, or feel. He thought about potential objections, misunderstandings, and the inevitable media scrutiny that might arise decades later. And then there was the most delicate layer, timing. The letter could not be delivered prematurely. It had to remain sealed until the appropriate moment, ensuring that its guidance would have maximum effectiveness without creating conflict during Philip's lifetime. It is here that the genius of Philip's foresight becomes clear. He anticipated the eventual opening of the letter would create shock, confusion, and controversy. But he also knew that by this point, William would have the temperament to manage the fallout. Harry, though potentially emotional, would be protected from impulsive access that could create unintended consequences. Philip's decision was not without emotional complexity. He loved both grandsons deeply, understood their unique qualities, and recognized Harry's potential. But love, in Philip's view, sometimes required restraint, protection, and difficult choices. The letter embodied this philosophy. It was a manifestation of care, strategy, and responsibility converging into a single act. As the years passed, Philip monitored the brothers from a distance. He observed William assuming greater responsibility, navigating public expectations with measured confidence. He observed Harry pursuing independent ventures, showing charisma, courage, and a desire to make his own mark. Each observation reinforced Philip's judgment. William's stability required access. Harry's impulsiveness required safeguards. The sealed letter became Philip's final instrument of foresight, a way to ensure that both grandsons could thrive within their strengths while being shielded from their vulnerabilities. It was not perfect. No human decision ever is. But in Philip's view, it was the most rational, loving, and strategic course of action possible. This chapter, perhaps more than any other, reveals the intersection of emotion, duty, and foresight in Philip's decision-making. He was neither cruel nor capricious. He was deliberate, calculated, and profoundly aware of the human stakes involved. The letter was his solution to a centuries-old problem: how to balance family, duty, and legacy in a world of unpredictable human behavior. And as we move to the next chapter, we will see the consequences of this decision, the way it reverberates through relationships, public perception, and the eventual dramatic revelation that stunned the world. The sealed letter was more than just words on paper. It was a reflection of decades of observation, judgment, and foresight. But once written, the question became, how would it shape the dynamics between William and Harry? How would it ripple through the family, influence decisions, and alter the course of their lives, long before anyone outside the palace ever knew? Even Prince Philip, strategic as he was, could not predict every emotional response. He understood personalities, behavior patterns, and potential consequences, but human emotion is never entirely controllable. He knew the letter's existence would create tension, even if it remained sealed for decades. The first impact of the letter was subtle, almost invisible. William and Harry were unaware of the specifics, but the undercurrent of difference in expectations and perception had already been set. William, naturally steady, accepted responsibility without question. He intuitively understood the weight of future obligations, the importance of measured judgment, and the need for careful consideration before action. Harry, however, felt an internal friction he could not name. There was a sense, unspoken and undefined, that he would face limitations in ways William would not. It was not resentment yet, only an instinctive awareness that certain doors seemed to open more easily for his older brother, while others remained uncertain or closed. Philip, observing from the sidelines, saw this dynamic as both natural and necessary. He recognized that each grandson's temperament required different forms of support and protection.